Well, I think it's 7:02, so more people, I presume, are going to come trickling in, but we will get started. For those who came in after, I just want to let everyone know that this session is being recorded. My name is Victoria Moore. I go by Tori. I don't know why I introduced myself as Victoria, but my name is Tori Moore, and I am one of the admission counselors at Olin College of Engineering. We are also excited to have you here today at the student research panel to learn a little bit more about student research at Olin and all it has to offer. We have two wonderful faculty moderators and three students who are going to be presenting. So if Jeff and Emily, you want to introduce yourselves?
I'll go first. I'm Emily Tao. I'm an assistant professor in mechanical engineering, and I do research related to thermal science and energy efficient water treatment.
Cool. I'm Jeff Dusek. I'm an assistant professor of mechanical engineering at Olin. My background is in ocean engineering and mechanical engineering. I have a lab at Olin called the Laboratory for Adaptation, Inclusion, and Robotics, or the LAIR, because I always wanted one of those. And we do research in marine robotics and assistive technology. So slightly disparate topics, but both really fun.
Maybe we can have our student panelists briefly introduce yourselves.
Hi, my name is Alex Butler. I'm a second year at Olin. I'm an electrical and computing engineering major, and we're all part of the same research group, but I, in particular, was focused on dissolved oxygen and electrical sensing.
Hi, I'm Kelly. I'm also a second year student and also studying electrical and computer engineering. I will also talk more about this later, but I was focused on the fluorescence and chlorophyll measurement aspect of this project.
Hi, I'm Nabi. Shockingly, I'm also a sophomore and also studying electrical and computer engineering. And I was focused more on the salinity and the conductivity side of the aquaculture research.
So thank you, panelists. So the format of this event is each of the student researcher panelists is going to give an introduction to their research, and then we should have about half an hour at the end for everyone to ask questions of the students, or you can ask me and Jeff. So students, could you kick it away?
Coolio. So before we start talking about what each of us did, I'll talk a little about how each of us got into the research and how, as freshmen, we were able to have this opportunity. And it basically boils down to the research fair. Here at Olin, we have a research fair in the second semester, the spring semester. And we're at the research fair, each of us saw Alessandra. And in my case, I thought the project was super interesting, so I talked to her and we had an outside conversation with Alessandra, and it all led to us working during the summer on this really cool project. Next slide. So I already introduced myself. I'm Nabi. I was born and raised in Colombia, the country way down south. I'm an international student. And right now I'm overworking myself on campus. I think I am the only, I'm the only student on campus of the three of us this semester. So who am I? I'm an ECE, and I still don't know what part I want to focus in. And I still don't know what I'm going to do after I graduate, whether it's going to be a master's or whether I'm going straight to work. It mostly has to do with the visa, but also I don't know what I would like to do. I love learning by doing. I'm a dual learner, which is something that you'll see a lot here at Olin. And before I started this research, I had some circuitry and programming experience, which was mostly programming. I hadn't worked with sensors that much, so it was super interesting to me. This past summer, what I did was we started with general aquaculture research, learning about the aquaculture community, learning about everything that has to do with aquaculture. And then we focused on different measurements that we wanted to test. I focused on dissolved ammonia and conductivity. And from those two, I zeroed in on conductivity sensing. And I was able to get my own sensors and design my own tests to determine the range and the accuracy of these sensors. We also grew algae, which was really fun. because besides all the sensing, we had this other project that was super different. These are some of the results I had. The image on the left is a sketch of how my sensing worked. That is the conductivity sensor on the left, and on the bottom is the temperature probe, because conductivity changes with temperature. And the main two tests I did was testing how the sensor measured if I was accounting for temperature and if I wasn't, to prove if the sensor actually needed the temperature and the temperature probe was worthwhile. And I also tested where the sensor started to drift and where the salinity became too high for it to keep measuring accurately. So how I got here, I already talked a little about how we, in his career, for at least in my side, I saw Sandra and it was super interesting, so I reached out to her and I was able to get into the research. And since I'm still not sure what to do, and if I want to go to grad school, research seemed like a really good option to keep open and be able to work on it. And also, since I don't know what to focus on, the sensing is one of the paths that I've always heard about for ECEs. So this seemed like a very good start to see if this was a path that I wanted to keep on.
Right, so my name's Alex. Some things have changed since that photo was taken at the end of the summer. So I was raised in Alaska for the first 18 years of my life, currently in Vermont with a couple other students. So if you hear anything in the background, I blame them. Next slide. So who am I? I'm an electrical and computer engineering student with a focus on sensing. Most of my background before I came to Olin was kind of playing around with Arduinos and Raspberry Pis and kind of messing around with some little circuitry to kind of get some readouts. And I kind of found that I really liked integrating the coding part with the boards that I was making. So very much a do learner. It's very open to interpretation, but the long and short of it is that I very much like using my hands to actually manipulate what I'm working on rather than just the theory behind it. You obviously can't do that with everything, but especially while remote, Olin has found some pretty interesting ways to make everything do learn still, and I'm very thankful for it. So post-graduation, my plans are very nebulous. Same with the B. Oh, whoops. There you go. So kind of nebulous, kind of up in the air what I'm looking to do. I've been kind of weighing like grad school versus industry, but I think it very much will just be determined by who I am at the end of these 4 years. So what I've been doing this summer, so this past summer, I did some exploratory aquacultural research. The first step for our research group, which was pretty cool, was that we had to do effectively a deep dive into the aquaculture community and be able to kind of understand what it was that the stakeholders needed from us to actually meet with our designs. And from there, I went into the route of dissolved oxygen sensing. Dissolved oxygen is, as it sounds, it's oxygen dissolved in a solution of water. And it's how fish are able to breathe with gills. There's a small amount of water, and so any change will cause some pretty detrimental effects in the fish. And so during the summer, because I wanted to study dissolved oxygen, I had a unique experience. I was able to do electrical and mechanical prototyping. I designed experiments which used that prototype, and then I had to do some basic chemistry along the way, some field work, and I ended up actually learning how to scuba dive through some lucky connections that I had this summer because we were actually all remote. Next slide. So in the more recent months, so I'm still doing research, and so is Kelly. So Kelly's research is more with fluorometry, which we'll go over. But I've been doing fluorometry with Kelly. We actually live in the same house, so it makes it significantly easier. And I'm now going on it focused in dissolved oxygen, it's whatever. So I'm towards dissolved oxygen fluorometry, which is not a new field, but it's not something that people really do, especially at the scale that we're doing it at. And we're also creating a tool that really hasn't been done before, especially for the price point that we currently have it marked out at, which is pretty interesting because you can't always, not everyone can say that they made a new tool that doesn't really exist before. Yeah. On the next slide. Oh, and then so this was my physical prototyping. So as I mentioned before, I got to design my own experiments, but part of having an experiment is you have to prove that all of your materials work before you can actually test anything. So you need some actual data beforehand. So this was my initial testing for actually the equipment that I used. So luckily enough, I had a pool next to me, so I was able to test the waterproofness of the actual case that I was using for my sensors. So the first photo, you can see it, I bricked it to the bottom of my pool. The second sensor, you can see Mach 2 of that, where I did a 24-hour underwater test. And there's a little piece of paper towel in there to see if any water would leak through. And then the third, I'm actually doing a battery test inside of the Pelican case. And what it's doing is it's just every 30 seconds, it's turning on, logging the time, and I think it's logging something else as well, and then turning off, and I was just seeing how long I could get some battery readouts for. And that should be my slides. Oh, yeah, whoops, I guess I have one more. So how I got here, so I piqued my interest during career fair. What all of us did, we all reached out to Alessandra individually and then kind of became a group once we noticed that we had a shared interest. For me, I was really into vehicle prototyping, and while that wasn't exactly what we did, I did something very similar this summer due to us being remote. So my route for research was all about linear. There's definitely a phase at the beginning where I wasn't really sure what it was that I needed to be doing, but I knew that I needed to be doing some sensing aspects of it. For a little bit, I was very much looking at just picking the best sensor in the world, and we needed to be doing a price point for it. But as I quickly learned, that wasn't what we needed to be doing. So there's a lot of skills that we end up learning along the way for research that were pretty important to like development, both me as a person and an engineer, I think. And so at the bottom, you can see there's a little graph of my uncertainty about where I'm heading after Olin. And I think because of research, I kind of have a better idea of how I would do either route, but I don't think I've really weighed the options of which one I'm doing.
Hi everyone, I'm Kelly. I was born and raised in California, and then I later moved to Washington, and currently I'm taking a leave of absence, and I'm hanging out with a couple of classmates in Vermont right now. So yeah, just again, a quick introduction. I'm also probably pursuing electrical and computer engineering. Haven't completely settled on that yet. But I came into this project with a lot of interest in sustainability and renewable energy technology. And it was great that I got to explore some of those realms with this project this summer. I also came into this project with a lot more experience on the software side of things, especially web design and web development, which wasn't directly applicable to the fluorometer I built, obviously, but that's, I guess, more to prove that, starting research at Olin doesn't have a ton of prerequisites, so it's really more about what you're interested in than what background experience you're coming in with, which I think is really neat. And I'm not exactly sure what I want to do after graduation either. I'm actually considering pursuing architecture, but that's a whole other story. So if you have questions about that, feel free to ask. But anyways, what I did this summer was I also did a lot of preliminary research into aquaculture. I focused specifically on parasitic species and infectious diseases, as well as chlorophyll concentration. And I got to grow some algae and experiment with that. And I did a lot of very basic circuitry work. And ultimately, I was able to build a functional fluorometer over the course of the 2.5 months. This is what it looked like at the end. It's a pretty simple setup actually. You just have a light source, a couple of optics, and then I don't know if you guys can see my mouse. I'm gonna keep using my mouse. Anyways, and then you've got a cuvette holder over here that contains a chlorophyll sample. And so the idea is you shine an LED at a known wavelength at this sample, and if it contains chlorophyll, if the concentration of chlorophyll is above a certain threshold, it'll fluoresce enough to be able to be detected by my photodiode, which is hidden in this black case on the right, or perpendicular to the sample, to the LED, sorry. And then, yeah, so the center image is just what it looks like when you shine blue light at a chlorophyll sample. It'll fluoresce red, and the picture on the far right is just what it looks like when it's turned on. And the picture on the left here is our algae colony. It's looking a little sad in that image, but it grew a lot right now. It's actually like a very dark dark green, which was surprising. But anyways, this was the sample that I was working with. And then on the right here, you can see the data that I collected from some very preliminary results or experimentation. And how I got here, I also went to the research fair, but before that, I was actually already working with Jeff in his lab, the Lair lab, during the year, and I've heard about this research opportunity early on. I ended up doing this internship, or I ended up doing research this summer instead of pursuing an internship because it really aligned with my interest in sustainability. And you, as a researcher at Olin, you have a lot of say in what you want to learn and what you want to pursue during your time on that project. And so I really couldn't find that kind of experience anywhere else, especially not at internships for first-year college students. And so that's a large part of why I decided to do that this summer. Like I said earlier, I already had interests in aquaculture and sustainable food production systems. And another reason that I was doing research this summer is because I applied to the Cbl Scholarship for undergraduate research, and I was lucky enough to get accepted to that. And so I got additional funding for like lab supplies, and like if I wanted to attend a conference, I would also get more financial support there. And so this was really a great opportunity for me to take advantage of. And that's pretty much, I think, all the slides we had prepared. Feel free, I think now we've got 40 minutes left for a Q&A session. Feel free to ask any of us, the students or faculty otherwise, questions about research, about what it's like to be at Olin. But yeah, or LOA stuff, if you're interested in how LOA works, I can answer that.
Great.
Awesome.
Already some questions coming in. Jeff, you wanted to tackle a couple of these.
Yeah, I was mostly tagging some ones that I thought would be interesting. One I think I'll ask you, Emily, maybe to start, is there was a question about whether Olin allocates funds for students to conduct summer research. And maybe you can say something about Claire Booth Luce and also other ways that we, promote student research.
Sure, yeah. So there are several ways that students can get funded to do research at Olin with faculty. Many faculty, like Jeff and I, apply for grants, and so we're able to pay students that way. We have, Kelly mentioned the Claire Booth Luce Scholarship, which supports at least 8 women students per year doing full-time research over the summer and continuing that research for pay in the academic year. And then Olin also spends internal funds to fund student research with faculty because they believe it's important for the intellectual development of both the students and faculty. So yeah, maybe
Yeah, and I'll
just talk about how, Jeff too, like how it has been for you finding funded research so far. And Jeff, what do you want to say?
Yeah, well, I was just going to add in briefly. So the project that Alex, Kelly, and Nabi have talked about, so there's 2 PIs at Olin on that project. So 2 faculty members that are leading that research effort. So myself and Alessandra Frizzoco, who was the primary advisor for these 3. So this summer we had actually 7 total students working on this project, thinking about the future of offshore aquaculture in New England. And that effort was funded by MIT Sea Grant, which is an offshoot of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, so NOAA. So that was the origin of that funding. So we brought in money from, an external source through a grant process, and we're able to pay students to do work over the summer, and then we're paying students to do work during the semester as well. So yeah, external funds. And then also Emily and I both had funds that the college provided us to kind of start our labs as new faculty members to get us started in research and get things going. So
that's true. I've sponsored 4 student researchers just from those funds that Olin gave me, just to spend on whatever kind of research I wanted to do with students. So that's been great. There's a couple more related questions that are more targeted for the students. So Nathan says, did Olin help you with the process to get the scholarship? I don't know, maybe referring to the Cbl Scholarship or generally to find funded research. And what is it like for students to get your research sponsored by professors?
I think I can tackle the how did I get help with the scholarship part, which was, yeah, so the Cbl Scholarship was something that was open to any female identifying student at Olin. And it was a really straightforward process to apply. And once you got accepted, Olin, I'm not sure how much of this, I feel like Emily, you might actually have a better answer for this because I'm not sure how much this was Olin helping and how much it was the program outside of Olin. But the process of applying and getting funding for your project was very straightforward. And once you're at that point, there were workshops and additional support for you once you had received your scholarship. So it wasn't just the funding part, but there was additional resources attached to that scholarship.
That's true. We also encouraged applicants to, I was in charge of the program to send their applications my way to get some feedback beforehand. So we're really trying to make sure that the applications were as strong as possible.
Emily, can I back up for 1 second? I want to say one other thing on funding. So we've talked a lot in the panel so far about projects that are kind of led by a faculty member, and then we find students to work on that. There's also mechanisms at Olin for students to pursue research sort of activities that are very self-directed. So there's a process called Passionate Pursuits, which are small pots of money for students to do things during the semester. There's also a mechanism called Student Academic Grants, where students can apply for funds to attend conferences in areas of interest that maybe aren't, part of the normal Olin curriculum, or, purchase equipment to do research projects of things that they're passionate about. So just to be clear that there's student-led, there's pots of money for students to do things that are completely kind of their own initiative, as well as things more associated with faculty members. So there's a question about research fair. So I think Nabi, you mentioned that in your intro. You want to say a little bit more about what research fair is, kind of what that looks like?
Yeah, so Olin has I'll say two big fairs during the year. One of them is in fall, that is career fair, that actually was today, where a lot of employers come and you can go around and talk to them and everything. And the other one is the research fair, which basically consists of professors that are doing research, like set up their stands normally it's in the dining hall. This year we'll see how it goes because we're not all here maybe. We still don't know what's gonna happen spring semester. But basically professors set their tables and students go around looking at the research professors are doing. And if something piques their interest, they simply reach out to the professor and ask if there's a spot where they can help or something like that. And normally the professor will find a way to, will get however many students they can to work with them. And you normally get a spot if you're really interested in something. Super, super, super nice.
And we do have a virtual research fair for the Olin students coming up in November. I forget the exact date. But yeah, we will be having a virtual research fair this fall because we have continued doing research even while in this remote environment. So over the summer, we had a very active research program, as you can see, and we still have students doing research this semester in all parts of the country and the world. So we're keeping it rolling.
We have a question here from Ayush that I'm really interested in, which is what sparked your interest in aquaculture and got you interested in this research? Navi, Kelly, Alex?
Okay, I'll go for it, Kelly. So what sparked my interest for aquaculture was the opportunities that are within it. So aquaculture around the world is relatively developed, but even in countries that it is developed in, it's relatively new. It's only in about the last 30 years that there's getting to economies of scale that are usable, that you can start replacing things like beef with grown fish through fish pens. And in the US, it really doesn't exist too well. There's too many barriers to entry. And so for me, when I originally heard about aquaculture through Alessandra, I was pretty interested because I'd never really heard about it before. And then when I did hear about it, it kind of made sense that we should be doing this, but it didn't seem like we really were. And then when I learned that there's also a technological aspect of there's just gaps in that aren't being met by engineers that could be met, I was pretty interested, especially when I realized there was a pretty substantial electrical component that was a part of that. And then Alessandra and I, it was right after the career fair, I invited Alessandra to lunch to talk more about aquaculture. She had mentioned that there was all of these opportunities, and it was kind of a nerd snipe to me because I then started going on about all of the opportunities of things that I could be developing for this and why it would be a great idea for me to be on this team. And then I got hooked on aquaculture pretty quickly.
Yeah, for me, I first learned about aquaculture through my Intro to Sustainability class. We were reading an article about how aquaculture could really be the future of sustainable food production, especially protein production. It's more cost effective, it's the issue, sorry, talking is really difficult when you haven't been talking to people for like 6 months. Hold on a second. Let me regroup. Yeah, so I learned about this through my Intro to Sustainability class, and sort of along the same lines of as Alex, I saw gaps where there was definitely a need for engineering solutions that wasn't being met by the community, and this sounded like a really neat project to, I guess, gain some technical knowledge as well as apply, what I was already passionate about.
Yeah, in my case, I knew a lot about aquaculture as a general idea because back home in Colombia, it's an important part of the economy. So I had learned about the general ideas. But then when I came here and I heard what Alessandra and Jeff were planning to do with the sensors and all their research, it seemed like a very interesting way to, what I already said before, see if the sensors part of ECE was interesting to me. So my knowledge in aquaculture and the sensors interest that I had was what led me to this path, actually.
So we had an interesting question about failure. Did you ever experience failure in your research? And how did you handle that? And I might add, what did you learn from the experience?
So correct me if I'm wrong, the question was what we've learned from failure and failure that we've experienced. Okay, so the research, engineering design process is very much built around failing and just learning from those mistakes. And that is very true in the research design cycle. However, I think you have to be a bit more meticulous about how you're going about things because things cost money. And so, at least for myself, there was definitely about a month where I had planned everything around a specific sensor. I had done a lot of work and we were getting to our buy order stage for our first round of prototyping. And it became very clear 3 days before that the sensor that I had picked out was actually off by an order of magnitude of 10 for the specific range that we needed to be measuring. And it was quite a whirlwind for me. I really had not messed up like that, especially in college to that scale, where I had months of evidence supporting what I had done and really not had anything from it to back up what I had done. So, and research, and especially with your professors, you learn that they're very much invested in your own success, so they want you to succeed. And so in my case, when I then came up to Alessandra and discovered that this sensor is actually not exactly what we thought it was was very clear of, okay, well, from here, we just need to make up this time. So it was, well, what's the next sensor that we should be going through? And since in research, you should be documenting everything, it's very easy to pick back up from where you left off. And so we were able to bounce back pretty quickly from that. And I think if there was a learning moment from that, it was to be extra clear on your documentation and extra clear about what it is that you're reading, because especially when you're remote and you don't have someone checking directly over your shoulder, it becomes increasingly important to be meticulous about your work.
Kelly or Nabi, did you have anything to add?
If I would think of like the biggest failure I had during research, I would talk about when we were starting to choose which words. When we were starting to choose which measurement we were going to focus on, I was really set on dissolved ammonia, and I put a couple of weeks work into reading everything dissolved ammonia. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, I started to realize that it was actually not that good of a measurement to focus on for the whole research because of a lot of different factors. So I had to backtrack and find a new measurement to focus on. And what I learned about it, besides the whole documenting, make sure you're checking everything you've done and know where you come from part that Alex said, is also to realize that sometimes the path you're on is not the best. And if you get to that point, realize that sometimes it's just better to scratch and start over than to keep pushing through a path that doesn't work, because that'll just eventually stall and give out.
I think for me, I can't think of any like technical failures really when like as far as this research project goes. But something that I did struggle with was initially when I got into this project and first started looking into using fluorescence to measure chlorophyll concentrations, et cetera, I had, I guess, expectations for myself that I'd be able to build this and then develop it further than it actually, than I was able to get it. And so I guess the failure part for me was failing to meet my initial expectations. And I think Olin really teaches the mindset of not treating that as a failure and more thinking about it as overscoping a project. And so it's hard, I guess for me, it's hard to answer this question because usually failure has such a negative connotation. And when we run into this type of failure, or at least from my experience running into this type of failure at Olin, it's taught, it's treated as a learning, as a, words is, I don't know why. Today has been incredibly difficult. You guys have probably noticed already. Basically what I'm trying to say is that, wow, my mind is just completely blank right now. I'm gonna think about this and type it out.
Sounds like a good plan. I mean, I feel like we had conversations in our research meetings this summer along the same lines, that research is sort of this whole learning and failure experience, and then there's usually a couple weeks of just like pure beauty and success. But the rest of it is just on the spectrum of like failure and learning. So thank you all for sharing your experiences with that.
Yeah, there's a question I wanted to highlight that I think is interesting. So Samuel asked, how many credits do these researchers get for doing research for an entire summer or semester? And I think I'll just answer that quickly. There's a few different ways that you can engage in research. So during a semester, a lot of students will do research basically on a volunteer basis because they want to kind of see how it works in kind of a low stakes kind of introductory environment. So that's great. And then students can do research during the semester for anywhere from 1 to 4 credits. And it can be either ungraded or it can be either graded or pass fail. And there's kind of some different requirements around like the sort of deliverables and the sort of documentation or things depending on how many credits you get and whether it's graded. So I have students that have done kind of really in-depth 4 credit hour research experiences, which are equivalent to like a full class. And then they submitted that work to a conference and that sort of stuff. During the semester, you can also do research for pay, and it's usually an hourly sort of rate. During the summer, students typically do research for a stipend. So yeah, I mean, that's typical to like a research experience for undergrad and RU program that you would see at a lot of colleges. So yeah, those are kind of the various examples of ways that you can get different types of credit or compensation for the research work. And then The other one that I had flagged, which I thought would be interesting for both the students and for Emily, was there was a question about how has COVID affected research? And do students that are not physically have the capability to perform research? I think if there's students who aren't on campus, that sort of thing, are they still able to engage in research? And I think since a good number of the students on this panel are not at Olin and we're not over the summer, maybe you can talk a little bit about how that experience was working remotely.
Um, so, so we were all off campus. Originally, when I had signed up for research, I was under the assumption that I was going beyond campus, so I did have to find my own housing. Olin was very generous in the way that they provided funding for students if you had signed on and you presumed that you would have your housing costs for the summer covered. So they offered an additional stipend for housing on top of the normal housing stipend. So this summer I was in Watertown, New York, which is about an hour south of the Canadian border of New York. And the way that research really manifested itself in my life was I initially tried to do it as more of a 9-to-5 job. I would wake up, eat breakfast, and then immediately go into meetings and then start doing research and put in as much time as I could. And that is one way to go about doing remote research. I quickly found out that wasn't the path that I found to be successful for myself. What my days ended up looking like, especially in the last month and a half, was I would find myself going into rabbit holes as to the parts of the research that I found more interesting. But I wasn't necessarily working 9-to-5. There were some nights that I would stay up till 2 because I was just really interested in my research and I had all of the tools that I needed at my disposal. And there were some days where I would have to stop at about 3 because you can only be underwater for about 2 hours. So there's a good work-life balance that you can find, and that is the benefit of remote work, and that does find itself in remote research as well. I do think that there was a number of unique opportunities that each of us were able to kind of explore. Because some of us were in some pretty unique geographic locations. So we had been expecting to test some of our stuff in the Boston Harbor, but unfortunately none of us are actually in Boston or were in Boston. So I got to test mine in Ontario. So that was a good analog. I know Nabi was in Florida, so he was able to do some stuff around there, which I'm sure he can talk about for days. Kelly and I are also continuing research this semester. And since we're living together, that makes it significantly easier. So we have a garage where we have our workroom in this house. And so we have a table that's set up with our entire optics rig set up. So it's very easy to just log on to work effectively. So for 6 hours a week, we log in our time and we do work together throughout the week. Yeah.
Yeah, I can also talk a little about how COVID, it changed a little what we all expected, because Alex said we all expect to be on campus. But one thing that was really useful for us, the first month of research, I was back home in Colombia. And then the other 2 months, I was, as Alex said, in Miami working. And it was really nice because for the first part, it was mostly research of find out and learn about aquaculture. So it was mostly reading and taking notes and having our notebook and journal and everything. So I could do most of that online. And then when I was already arriving to Miami, we were able to order sensors, and the college was super nice that we ordered the sensors to wherever we were staying, and we worked on them. And Alex and Kelly, I'm pretty sure they still have theirs with them. I have mine here at Olin, and they were although it was impacted and we had plans to travel to conferences and things, it was I think it was the best way to adapt to what had come, and we were able to do a lot of what we planned to do without the need to be on campus, which was super nice.
Cool. And I mean, Emily, what about you from the kind of advising standpoint? How did that work out? How did the summer go for you, essentially?
It was surprisingly successful. The remote research has been working better for my project that's a pure modeling and literature review type of project where we're not using physical equipment. There were definitely challenges in the other project involving measuring the thermal conductivity of textiles that did involve more debugging of homegrown physical equipment, and that was something that was pretty challenging to do remotely that would have been easier if we were together, but it didn't bring the research to a grinding halt. It just made certain things more challenging. But I've been really amazed with the engagement of students in research. So both of the students that are working with me this semester are not currently studying at Olin. One is on a leave of absence and is doing research just as a volunteer because she wants to continue. And one student is was an exchange student who's now back at his home university in Sweden, and he's just continuing the research because he wants to do it. And I think it's just amazing that despite being physically distant and everything that's going on, they're still carrying on with the research, which is pretty incredible.
Yeah, I would agree. I had a total of 7 students this summer on 2 different projects and sent them equipment, and they did cool stuff. And we had conversations like this, and it was actually a lot of fun. I'd rather been in the lab with them, but made the best of it. Emily, you flagged a few questions. You wanna ask some of those?
Yeah, sure. I'm trying to remember which one. Lots of good questions. So there was one from Ayush that says, are the research projects student-driven, or do the professors pursue their research and students assist them? Definitely both. So student-driven research can be funded by the student academic grants and can be done as an independent study, typically for credit. And there are also a lot of faculty-driven or more like faculty-originated research projects. So for example, the Aquaculture project originated as a faculty project, but I think it's pretty rare that we have the traditional undergraduate research model of the faculty member has this research plan and the students use the pipette or whatever to assist them. It's, in my experience so far, I've only been at Olin about 2 years, it's much more integrated, like the faculty and students form a research team and are sort of equally helping each other and shaping the research. I don't know, what do you think? Jeff and Nabi and Kelly and Alex, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I've had the opportunity to actually work with students to help me write grants. So they've been involved in the actual, origination of some of the ideas. And I think research in general, things go in really interesting ways, right? Like as a, the primary investigator on a project, you come up with this idea. It is rarely that's the way things actually go. And some of the best results come from the ingenuity of the students that are actually working on the stuff day to day. So, yeah, I think my role is to just kind of facilitate and enable and provide resources and, see what happens.
Yeah, I think students at Olin very much get to pick what they want to work on. Like usually the professor already has a team or a project they've been working on for a while, and when students jump on board, they get to choose specifically what they want to focus on. Like for instance, all 3 of us got to pick which sensors or which measurements we wanted to do this summer.
So we've heard a lot.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
So student-driven research, and I guess so research at Olin doesn't look like research at other universities, and it's very distinct. So Kelly touched on it very briefly there at the end, which was that we each got to choose our own paths. And it wasn't just like the path that we took that was chosen, but almost all facets of what we did this summer were self-directed. So Alessandra and Jeff and Emily were all resources for us. But at the end of the day, it was very much whatever direction we wanted to take it with was the direction that the research would go. It was more so that it had to coalesce under the aquaculture and moored profiler umbrella. And that was a very interesting experience to kind of have as a student. And Olin, I think this is a very interesting way of doing research because it's a very Olin-y way to do it. Is normally if you're doing research through a bigger institution, you have the top professor who's kind of laying down the work of we need to take it in this direction. You usually have graduate students that are underneath them that are kind of breaking up and delegating from there, who are doing some more like high level research. And then usually undergraduates are kind of the lowest on the tier list there, and they kind of have to follow the direct decisions of graduate students or the faculty advisor at the top. And that very much just isn't the case at Olin. And it's odd to me to see the regular research or the normal research model now, because I personally don't see myself really in there, because I really wouldn't have a voice, and it's very nice to have a voice in what it is that you're doing, especially when it's on a scale like this.
Thanks. I think very much related to this is a question from Shane, which is what would a typical day look like for students doing research in the summer? So maybe for the three of you, you're on the same project, but day to day, your research looked pretty different. Could you talk through what that was like for you?
That really depended on what phase of the research project we were on. Like at the beginning, for instance, when we all got on board and pretty much had no background experience in aquaculture, we spent a lot of time reading not newspapers, reading articles and journals about aquaculture and getting a very foundational like knowledge of that topic. And then from there, once we had parts moving in, my day-to-day activities was a combination of continuing to do like research and taking notes and reading articles, but also playing around with the tools I had access to. You know, I had to CAD mounts for my optics, for instance, and I had to build a black box so I can encase everything. And then I also had to, tend to my algae colony. And so it really depended and varied depending on what you were working with and what you had access to at what point.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is what Alex said before. You also had some days where you worked on the sensor all day and then it was just end your day at midnight, or there were other days where at 2 a.m. you were down a rabbit hole reading about some interesting thing you found or some interesting measurement that you didn't know about. So the day-to-day, especially because we were online and we had our own schedules, it changed a lot.
Yeah, early on, I think I had originally taken a route of just like looking at EPA regulations. So that ended up being a half week for me, was reading literally every single EPA regulation that revolves around aquaculture. And it's very vague, to give you the long and short of it. But near the end, I found myself having a very interesting balance where I had experiments that I could kind of run for 24 hours and not have to be observing the entire time. I ended up learning how to dive. That was really cool. So that ended up being some of my work days. And then there was just write-ups, usually ended up being the last half of research, was kind of just making sure to write down everything that I had done.
So I'm gonna hop in and just say one thing is, it should be pointed out probably that the students on the panel have a very unique Olin research experience in that it was a remote one this summer. The more typical Olin research experience is, one of the really interesting things about doing research at Olin during the summer is the college actually provides housing to summer research students. And so it's really cool during the summer. You know, the campus is a little less full, but you have a cohort of students that are living together, working on research, doing things in the evenings socially together, enjoying weekends together, things like that. So you get this like foundation of this kind of cool research community on campus during the summer, which I really enjoy. And there was a question, do faculty members help you define the problem you are trying to solve before you start the research? And do you check in with faculty members every week? I'll answer the second part about that. Typically when we're on campus, students are in the lab, and as a faculty member, I'll check in with them a few times a day, see how things are going, try not to hover, but be there as a support system. In the remote this summer, we checked in a few times a week, try not to overwhelm people with Zoom meetings. And as far as faculty members helping define the problem, maybe one of you could speak on that quickly, but then I know Emily had tagged some other questions as well.
Or maybe more generally, like, what did your faculty mentors help you with?
So we ended up actually having a pretty decent amount of meetings, I would say, for being a remote work. So I think we had two meetings on Mondays, we had one meeting on Wednesday, and then a meeting on Thursday and a meeting on Friday. And the Thursday meetings were actually very interesting because what we did is we ended up combining research groups for forget the name of what we ended up calling it, but it was a combined session where we would present what we had done over the past 2 weeks with Emily's group. And that was very interesting because we could have a fresh set of eyes looking over what we had done. So while it was very unconstructed on the day by day, there was a very constructed week by week pace that was kind of expected of us. So it wasn't that we were completely on our own, left to our own devices. There was definitely some structure of we should be meeting our goals. But it was very nice to have some sense of community when we had originally been expecting to be on campus with each other. So while we weren't face to face, we were still on Zoom face to face, which was a nice analog.
Kelly or Nabi, did you have anything to add? Do you have anything to add about what's unique about doing research at Olin? Alex explained his perspective, but did either of you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I think we've kind of touched on that a lot already. I think the self-directed part is really the biggest appeal to me, because I have had internship experiences before going to Olin, and at in the high school and first and second college year level, you really don't get a chance to direct your own projects a lot of time. And so I think that's probably one of the main points that where research at Olin stands out to me.
Yeah, I think I would also talk about that, and also how what we're doing actually matters to the overall project, and it's not just like a filler mini project so that we have work experience, but it's an actual important part of the big research group, which it happens more in internships than in research, but sometimes, especially for a high school freshman and lower case people who are working in the summer, you get projects that are just fillers while you get work experience. But in this case, it was an actual thing that we knew mattered for the actual research group, which was really, really interesting.
That's great. Thanks for sharing. So I think we just have time for a couple more questions. I like this question from Nathan, which is, what advice would you give to someone who is thinking about doing research for the first time?
One of the ones that comes to mind in my case first is have an open mind of what you're going to do. Because especially in research, the path is not always set in stone. And it can change. Like in my case, the I thought immediately about me changing my measurement halfway through. So be open to changing what you're doing or what you're expecting would be the first. I don't know if any of you have any other ideas of what you would tell someone starting your research.
I would say that you should be really open to feedback early on. And for me, at least, the team/community aspect of this project was incredibly helpful. And so learning how to utilize the resources around you, especially your mentors and your peers, was incredibly valuable. Alex mentioned earlier, we had weekly Thursday sessions where we would present our research and get feedback. And I think those were probably the two most productive hours of our week, is when we got to talk it over and hear what other people had to say about what we were doing and get a fresh set of eyes on some of the problems that we'd been trying to debug ourselves for the last few days.
Yes, generally just having a sense of openness, I guess, to new ideas, because it can be very easy to think that you got the right idea and the right perspective on the first try, but that's usually not the case, and you usually need to hear other people out about it. And that was very much the case, I think, just about all of our situations this summer. So yeah, it was very helpful.
Emily, there was a question that I saw that you tagged that was about what are some other student research projects that are happening at Olin. So I dropped a link to some examples, but I was wondering if we wanted to do kind of a rapid fire, if there were someone that you remember. So I can point out a few. So we have several faculty that do research in kind of engineering education. So thinking about pedagogy and the effectiveness of various, different teaching methods, which is really awesome. Professor Allison Wood does some really cool stuff in sustainability. Her background's in civil engineering. So that can be really interesting stuff. What else? Tim Ferguson Sauter is a trained designer and usually has some students working on some really interesting like commercial design, like graphic design sort of projects in the summer. Paul Ruvolo does some really interesting work in navigation by visually impaired users. So designing phone apps that help visually impaired users navigate around indoor environments, which is an extremely challenging topic. Carrie Nugent, one of our kind of younger colleagues, finds asteroids and protects the world from Armageddon. Or at least that's the way I like to think about her research. But yeah, applies kind of machine learning sort of techniques to identify asteroids in these huge data sets of pictures of the sky. Sam Michalka does computer brain interfaces and like controlling robots by thinking or something super awesome like that. Katrin Lynch is an anthropologist at Olin, does research related to the kind of lived experiences of mill workers, so people that work in the textile industry, which is really cool, things that I don't know anything about. Chris Lee, another MECI professor, is working on kind of biomedical applications for 3D printing and thinking about how you can print 3D models of organs that react to diagnostic tests in the same way that human tissue does. Whitney Lohmeyer does cool things with radio communication. I don't know. Anyone else that I'm forgetting, Emily?
I think that there's maybe a handful of other people that do research, and all of them, it's very integrated with working with students. I think, as maybe Alex brought up in the chat, because we don't have a graduate program, research is faculty and undergrads working together. Yeah, so it's really special. So we've got just one more minute. There were a couple of questions in the chat that I was just sort of saving for later because there were so many good questions that were specifically about research, but this is a Office of Admission Financial Aid event. So why don't we end with, there were a couple questions about what is the most special, surprising, unique thing that you love about Olin? And I'd love to hear from our three panelists.
I wouldn't know about the surprising thing, but one of the things I love the most about Olin, and it's gonna sound cheesy and all, but it's the people and the size. We're very small, and you basically know everyone. By a point in the year, you basically know everyone in Olin, and everyone's super nice, and everyone's always willing to help you, and absolutely hang out with you if you need anything. And it's super nice to know that everyone's always there. So for me, it would be the people, definitely.
Kind of along the same lines of that, I think I already answered this when someone asked like what your favorite part of Olin was, and I typed this in the chat, but I was saying that for me, the community aspect is incredibly important. Like at a lot of small technical engineering colleges, it's a very competitive atmosphere, and it's very, grades and, GPA internship focused, and people are like definitely driven at Olin, but you don't get that sense of competition, and the peers around you are really there. You feel that they're there for support more so than, someone you're competing against to get this internship or whatever. And so me, that's kind of what that's probably one of the things I love most about Olin.
And mine's kind of on the same note. The community of Olin is probably one of its strongest factors, and it ultimately was what made me want to come to Olin. So by nature, you end up knowing everyone in your class within the first 2 weeks. But I realized from there that really cuts you off if you're only learning the people in your class. So some of my closest friends that I think I've ever made are actually upperclassmen that I go to college with, and Granted, I can't really see them face to face now anymore, which is very unfortunate, but a lot of growth as me as a person and as an engineer has definitely been from the upperclassmen, like role models that have been able to be like next to me and have been able to like lead me through a lot of like tough times through like through projects and situations. And so there's a lot of facets of the community, and all of them are very important to me, but I think the upperclassmen definitely have a lot of ingrained parts of Olin that you just have to look out for, that are probably my favorite.
Okay, well, I think that's our time. Thank you all so much, the panelists, for presenting and answering these questions. Thank you to everyone who attended and added your voices through the questions in the chat. Does anyone else have any parting words?
I'm just going to plug the rest of Open October at Olin. We have a lot of other fun events coming up. So presumably all of you registered at least for this. So I recommend checking out the other events that we have coming up in the next week or two. So stay tuned, and thank you for being here. Thanks, panelists. Bye, everyone.